God, in his providence, wanted Jewish people to have a most accurate telling of the time for his preservation of his people and preservation of his calendar, and gifted them with a more accurate calculation. Wonderful. But when you start reading through passages in the oral law, and when you read traditions and concepts and this and that, they don't make a distinction between this is how we calculate something legally, and here's some good folk remedies and folk advice. It's all part of the same thing, and you have to take the good with the bad. But you have chronological errors in the Talmud. You have scientific errors in the Talmud. And you have things with scientific accuracy. You have things with historical accuracy. You have both. You have the good and the bad. That's just part of the oral tradition. The discovery seminars of Eish HaTorah have been celebrating the Bible codes, the Torah codes, for some years, saying that if you will study those carefully, it will prove the supernatural inspiration of the Torah. In fact, what they normally don't tell you at the seminars is also to show you that Jesus was a false prophet and so on. What are the problems with those views? Well, first, the view of the Torah codes, which allegedly would point to the supernatural origins of Judaism. They're based on letter-perfect texts. In other words, they're based on counting letters. You start at this letter and you go this far, and then this letter this far, 4 spaces between, or 6 or 8, or however many letters in between, and then you count sequences, and you come up with these codes and these special meetings that allegedly, talk about 9/11 and the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin and so on and so forth. So the first thing is they presuppose a letter-perfect text, but we do not have the authoritative original text of the Hebrew Bible. We have manuscripts, and the manuscripts do not agree perfectly. Not only so, we know in the development of the Hebrew language that spelling conventions changed. Just like English spelling has simplified British English, American English spelling has simplified British English spelling. So color in English is C-O-L-O-U-R. We've dropped the U. The word judgment, when I was growing up, as I remember it, learning it, was with an E at the end. Judgment with an E after judge, J-U-D-G-E-M-E-N-T. We have commonly dropped the E in our spelling. Many things like that. Spelling conventions change. If you look back to Old English, the earlier renditions of the King James, music is spelled with a final K. So we know from ancient inscriptions and from the history of the Hebrew language, and that's part of what I studied in my PhD studies, we understand that spelling conventions changed so that the Torah as we have it now was not as it was originally spelled. Spelling conventions changed. I'm not talking about meanings of words. I'm not talking about sequences of words or verses. I'm simply talking about spelling changes, just like spelling changes from the old King James to the King James today. So that totally changes all the letter sequences. Once you change that, it changes the letter sequence. Plus, there are plenty of scholars who have looked at the Torah codes. Even there are Christian scholars who believe in the inspiration of the Scriptures, and Jewish scholars who take seriously the authority of the Scriptures, and they say absolutely that statistically the Torah codes are bogus. There's great debate about it. And then there are others, there are Christian scholars who many years ago, Panin being the one I would think of most prominently with New Testament studies, who, based on the Greek manuscripts, came up with these extraordinarily brilliant codes throughout the New Testament, said the only possible explanation is the divine inspiration of the New Testament. There's no other possible way. To me, it raises a more fundamental issue. Is that ever how God spoke? Is that ever what his intent was? Look for a secret code that'll prove inspiration? Isn't the message of the book the message of the book? So as for the alleged Torah codes, first, they're based on letter-perfect manuscripts as if the original spelling never changed. That we don't have. Secondly, there are strong arguments that other statistical scholars have raised against the Torah codes. You can get online and do searches for Bible codes, Torah codes, and get into a massive amount of material information. Make your head spin. So there are valid arguments that can be raised against it. And then there are all kinds of arguments I've seen to support the supernatural inspiration of the New Testament scriptures based on codes and things like that. And then Messianic Jews who found codes of Yeshua through the scriptures and so on. And the rabbis say, oh, well, those codes are not valid. They're not as sophisticated as our codes. It's just, again, one of these things. If this is your big proof, I genuinely, with all my heart, feel very bad for people who became Orthodox Jews based on the alleged Bible codes or Torah codes. It is a very faulty foundation for your faith. What about the argument that Yeshua himself validated the oral law? Here, come on, let's just take a look in Matthew, the 23rd chapter. Matthew 23. Didn't he, in fact, validate the oral law? Yes, it's a chapter in which he's rebuking hypocritical religious leaders. But look at what he says. Matthew 23:1, then Yeshua said to the crowds and to his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, so you must obey them and do everything they tell you, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy loads and put them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. And everything they do is done for men to see. He goes on from there. So is Yeshua telling his disciples, especially his Jewish disciples, you've got to obey the Pharisees? They sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, you obey the later rabbinic traditions. Therefore, you must adhere to the oral interpretations and the oral traditions. Of course, it's quite shocking to read that when you remember some of his other comments. We've quoted in earlier sessions, like Mark 7, where he says you have a fine way of setting aside the commandments with your traditions, or you make the word null and void with your traditions. And then we know in certain places, for example, the issue of hand washing before eating, he takes issue in Matthew 15 and Mark 7 with some of the Pharisaical practices. He does differ with some of the traditions. You say, well, but that's what they did. I mean, here it says you must do what they tell you, but don't do what they do. No, they taught about hand washing as well as practiced it, and Yeshua took issue with that. He never took issue with the written Torah, but with the oral interpretations of it, he sometimes took issue. Certain things he certainly practiced that were part of the custom of the people, or were even Pharisaic. Going to a synagogue was a Pharisaic innovation. Yeshua went to the synagogue. There were certain things he did in his life that would resemble, if you want to call it, Orthodox Judaism of its day, although that's an anachronistic term. I'm projecting back something that gives a slight wrong impression. Just like, Jesus wearing a yarmulke gives a wrong impression because that was not, they didn't wear little yarmulkes, and that would have not been the sign of orthodoxy in the day anyway. But what's he actually saying here? First, it seems it's more of a concession than anything. Look, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, so you must obey them, do everything they tell you. Sitting in Moses' seat does not just seem to be a metaphor for authority, but they're actually ancient synagogue discoveries in the last century. There was what would be called the seat of Moses, a seat where the teacher would sit and exposit in the front of the synagogue. So first, this seems to be more of a matter of concession than command. Some have interpreted it that to the extent they are sitting in Moses' seat and telling you to follow Moses, obey them, do everything they tell you. But don't do what they do. In other words, their own innovations and practices. They don't practice what they preach. In fact, they tie up heavy loads, put them on men's shoulders. They themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. That's one view. Another view is that this is biting